Hi everybody, this is Leo Vallon with part 4, the final part of my series, The Material Mechanics of Spirituality. When I first read James's Varieties of Religious Experience back in college, the materialistic analysis of the schema stunned me. It probably took me decades to thoroughly work through the denial and digest what I'd read. I suppose one of my first insights in this regards occurred to me when I came across a Buddhist monastery in the Far East during my earliest stint of world travels. I found that in the whole establishment there wasn't a single monk who had himself voluntarily enrolled into the monastery. They had all been there since infancy, having either been left on the doorstep in a basket or been endowed for life and then walked away from. You see, they were largely illegitimate children, born to girls who had committed youthful indiscretions, and if the resultant babies could be taken off their hands, then perhaps they could once again pass for virgins, marry, and enjoy a normal life. But anyway, essentially these monasteries were, in functional terms, warehouses for people who had no place in the larger society. But yes, I had read of both monastic traditions in Catholic Europe and monastic traditions in Asia, where it really had seemed that the pursuit of religious enlightenment had been the point of it all. Was there along the line some change in mission or a reordering of purpose? Or are both aspects true in their separate contexts? Well, I suppose we need to take a closer look. Okay, first, how do you even run a monastery? Even if some of the children are dropped off with endowments, we could expect most to depend upon charity. Food, clothing, and firewood would always come at a cost. Also, we must wonder about the convenience of the caregivers. Yes, children would be easy enough to manage because if they misbehaved, they could literally be handled. But what about regulating the behaviors of the adults? Remember that these monks are not just orphans as children, but orphans for life. So no, they couldn't be allowed to grow into adults full of self-will, with their own opinions on how to run everything, arguing, talking back, and even bursting out into angry fits of rage in reaction to their lives of tedium, privation, and endless frustrations. No! That kind of stuff's not permitted. So the whole system would be impossible if a way couldn't be found to contain and pacify these inmates. Remember that back in ancient times they didn't even have jails or prisons because of the prohibitive expense of supplying food and maintaining guards. So they simply killed criminals. But surely the ancient world would draw the line at killing babies, right? Well, let's look at it. We read of nose-pinching babies that don't pass their initial health and hardiness inspections, and that some cultures would put off birth registration ceremonies until the 7th day in order to determine whether or not the infants qualified as keepers. But what happens to the non-keepers, right? So yes, the ancient world was not above killing babies. So these monastic babies we're talking about, being allowed to live and grow to be adults, well, what made them so different that the cruel, hard, cold heart of the ancient world softened for them? Well, the way I figured it is the compromised but still beloved daughters of good families would have been outraged if their babies had been snuffed out by those nose pinches. I imagine that these young girls would only agree to return to virtue and play their parts in reflecting well upon the honor of their families if their babies were given a respectable place somewhere in society, and religious-oriented monasteries would fit that bill perfectly. And from that there developed a religious, monastic, ascetic ideal. Now think how convenient the ascetic part of the religious, monastic, ascetic ideal is for the monastery's management. First, we have the vows of poverty. Well, poverty is easily arranged. Then in regards to boarding, the food budget would be easier to handle if vegetarianism and periodic fasting became the norms. The cover for self-will, arguing and talking back, well, there we have the vows of obedience and humility. Many religious orders had vows of silence, which is effectively, shut up, we don't want to hear it. Finally, we have the vows of celibacy. Of course they couldn't be allowed to reproduce, but they needed to be given some excuse to cover for their inevitable sexual frustrations, and so they literally made a virtue of necessity. Now let's think about these ideals for a moment. Imagine if any one of us were to be put into a situation like that, subjected to rules that seem designed to make our lives utterly miserable. Well, how do you think we would cope? Well, most likely we wouldn't. The body's autonomic nervous system would be dysfunctional if it didn't click to provide some kind of an accommodation to make a hellhole like the typical monastery seem in some way bearable. And so of course these places are the source of all our classically described religious spiritual realizations, our enlightenments, our nirvanas and satoris. Monasteries were the nervous breakdown capitals of the world. That they weren't just veritable insane asylums manufacturing their own insanity is attributable to the care they took to structure the adaptive rebuilds around a respectably ideal religious model. In these monasteries, religion permeates everything and no other cognitive distractions are permitted. Prayers are scheduled morning, noon, and night, and there are chapel services several times a day. Religious iconography is all over the place. So of course when they finally melt down, they'll naturally pour themselves into the religious molds that sit waiting for them. Yes, in reading of these saints, we are expected to suppose that they are speaking and writing from divine revelation. But now we find it much more likely that they only reveal what had been echoing in their ears since childhood. Yes, this medieval monastic model explains a lot. Decades ago, I read a book about Zen Buddhism by D.T. Suzuki, 1870 to 1966. And he was talking about a Zen Buddhist conference that had recently been held in Japan, a big one that convenes only once every generation, and he remarked that everybody was collectively embarrassed to find that nobody attained Satori enlightenment this time around. So yeah, he wondered what went wrong. Well, duh! These are modern times and Japan was becoming prosperous with a high standard of living. There were no longer any monastic warehouses with their pressurized privations and miseries to react to. So of course nobody at that swanky resort conference could be expected to have a quasi-spiritual nervous breakdown. The kind of Satori experience they wanted could only be accessed through a biopsychological escape hatch. And an optimistically forward-looking Japan tracing its upward arc to having the highest standard of living in the world, well, that was not the kind of place anybody would want to escape from. Well, not unless they were a live fish flopping around on a table in a sushi restaurant. So yes, when the status quo of normal life is already like sailing on pallid blue waters, then isn't an obsessive goal-oriented spirituality only making waves and rocking the boat? So shouldn't we all just focus on learning to cope well with life and just be happy? But if things ever do go sour, well, we can assume that spirituality would automatically assert itself, wouldn't it? Crisis and breakdown would be our silver linings around any significantly dark cloud, right? But yes, as a kind of an insurance plan, it probably would be wise to recommend that we educate ourselves in the social, moral, and aesthetic ideals in order to give oneself the proper cognitive foundation so that if crisis ever did strike and we were broken down and reduced to enlightenment, well, our adaptive response would turn out to be a commendable one and not just either some bizarre, transcendental, nihilistic dress code fashion embarrassment or some idealization of reactive hate. Maybe our ideal should be to make each other happy by making our world a better place to live in. Well, that's it for this series. Thanks, everybody. If I think of anything else, I'll let you know. No. Thanks again. Bye.